Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a pleasure to be with you today on this 5th of May. It's a Monday. It's a beautiful Monday, and it is a delight to be here with you on this Monday afternoon in the spring. It's been a few days. I was mentioning in chit-chat with Bob before we went on the air that when I'm off 4 or 5 days between programs, I find that I get a little bit nervous when I'm coming back on, and it seems like when I'm doing them every day, I don't think about. I really don't have time to worry about that. But when I'm off for 3 or 4 days, I get a little bit nervous because I want to make sure that the program is effective, and that the fact that you all that we're asking you to devote a portion of your time to this program, I take very, very seriously. And the last thing I want is for you to basically say to yourself even that it was a waste of time, because that's the one thing I think I fear most. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you today, and I've got one significant announcement that I want to make. It won't affect this week's program, but it will for the next 2 weeks after this week. I'm going to be doing some traveling from the end of this week for the balance of the following week and the most of the week after that. It'll be about 2 weeks I'll be out of pocket. So I'm want to announce that we will be doing today's program along with tomorrow's and Wednesday's, the May 5th, 6th, and 7th. But then for the next 2 weeks, I think we will be on the road, and we're attending some graduations and doing some better late than never, visiting in the process and all of that. So we're going to be on the road quite a while, and I wanted to announce that. And I'm kind of assuming, although I haven't talked to Bob Kincaid about it, but I assume that we'll probably be using some of our pre-recorded programs during that interim, during that hiatus. But I did want to announce that and hope that you can use the time advisedly. Again, let me invite you to participate in our program today. I would love to hear from you. Our phone number, as always, is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email and exchange your thoughts and ideas and concerns or whatever, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, BRIEN 906, all one word, at gmail.com. I might also mention that tomorrow we have here in the Beckley, West Virginia area our regular Rotary weekly meeting at noon on Wednesdays, and I'm going to be delivering the program tomorrow, and the program will be on what we've been talking about and what I'd like to pursue today, because I believe it's that important, is the likelihood and the pros and cons and possibilities as well as dangers of a second constitutional convention. I think it is quite significant that it's not getting a lot of media attention on the national level. It's getting some, but not a lot. And in conversation earlier, Bob and I were sharing the fact that we're beginning to see progressives who are beginning to look at the idea of a second convention as an opportunity to overturn Citizens United. So in a sense, what we're seeing is that there's sentiment from both sides of the aisle, so to speak, that a constitutional convention might be a good thing. And I think that's part of the issue that we need to address as to what the potential of this is, what the likelihood is of this being a managed, well-managed, refined convention, or the alternative, which is the idea of a runaway convention. I think it's very, very important to recognize that in the articles we looked at in our programming last week, and I'll make reference to them again, George Will, in one of his articles, makes the point about the fact that many people are concerned about the threat of a second convention for fear that it'll be a runaway convention. As I've mentioned in previous programs, and I mention it again here, I also am very, very concerned about the dangers of a runaway convention. And part of the reason is, there are a number of reasons why I believe that. Probably the most prominent one is that the only constitutional convention that we've had, which is the 1787 Philadelphia Convention that drafted and ratified the Constitution, was in effect a runaway convention. That convention was called to revise the Articles of Confederation. And once the delegates were in the room, and once the doors were locked, and the meeting was gavelled into operation, then the decision was made to scrap the Articles of Confederation and start all over again with a new document, which was, of course, the Federalist plan going in. I mean, Federalists had been planning this for some time, and Madison was ready with what the textbooks refer to as the Virginia Plan, the large state plan that was drafted principally by James Madison. So in a sense, the only constitutional convention per se, as such, that we've had in this nation was, in effect, a runaway convention. So I think there's precedent for that. And again, I am, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the George Will piece in mid-April, I believe on the 16th of April, in the Washington Post, in which he addressed the Goldwater Institute's approach for a well-managed, well-regulated, confined convention that would operate by compact. And this Compact for America that the Goldwater Institute is promoting basically proposes the following amendment. The purpose of the Constitutional Convention from this perspective is the Balanced Budget Amendment. Of course, that presumes that once the convention is called, it will limit its order of business to that one amendment, that one issue, which is balanced budget. And as we'll see today, that has serious implications and dangers as well. But the upside of that, if there is one, is the fact that at least the business of the convention would be refined and would be confined to that one issue. So let me, if I can, repeat the proposed or the draft amendment, balanced budget amendment, that the Goldwater Institute is promoting. And here it is. Total federal government outlays, expenditures, shall not exceed receipts unless the excess of outlays is financed exclusively by debt, which initially shall be authorized to be 105% of outstanding debt on the date the amendment is ratified. So government expenditures would be limited to government income, with the exception of debt, which would be limited to 105% of existing debt on the date that the amendment is ratified. So in other words, what you do is when this amendment is ratified, then you have a number, which is the existing debt on that date. And the federal government's debt, deficit spending, if you will, from that point on, would be limited to 105% of that number. In other words, just 5% over that would be the max. All right, that's the first sentence. To continue, Congress may increase the authorized debt only if a majority of state legislatures approve an unconditional single subject measure proposing the amount of such increase. In other words, if Congress wanted permission to go exceed the 105% deficit spending, it would need a approval of the majority of the state legislatures, and in order to get that approval, there would have to be a single subject measure talking about why it was necessary to exceed that. In other words, justification for the request. Whenever outstanding debt exceeds 98% of the set limit, this is still part of the draft amendment, whenever outstanding debt exceeds 98% of the set limit, the President shall designate for impoundment specific expenditures sufficient to keep debt below the authorized level. In other words, once government spending reached 98% of its allotment, in other words, it came close to spending all the money it had, at that point, the President would undertake the process of impounding expenditures in order to make sure that the debt was controlled. The impoundment shall occur in 30 days unless Congress designates an alternative impoundment of the same or greater amount. Any bill for a new or increased general revenue tax shall require a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, except for a bill that reduces or eliminates an existing tax exemption, deduction, or credit, or that provides for a new end-user sales tax, which would completely replace every existing income tax levied by the United States government. In other words, it seems to me that this draft has an option at the end whereby if there's support for a national sales tax to replace the income tax, then government would have permission to do that. Anyway, that's the amendment that is being proposed by the Goldwater Institute, the so-called balanced budget amendment. And then to go a little bit further in the article and talk about a few of the details. And again, I'm quoting George Will here. Article 5 of the Constitution says that Congress really has no discretion in this matter. It shall call a convention once requested by 2/3 of the states. It shall call a convention on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, unquote. That's what the Constitution, Article 5, says. A convention called in accordance with the Institute's compact, the draft that I just read, would adopt its limited agenda with the force of federal and state law, any deviation from which would render the convention, which is limited to a 24-hour session, void. The compact designates as the sole delegates to such a convention the governors of the participating states. So in other words, this convention would be called by compact. By previous agreement, the states in attendance would agree that the only issue on the table will be this draft of this particular balanced budget amendment. The convention will have 24 hours to act. If it doesn't act within the 24 hours or does anything outside the parameters of those rules, then the business of the convention is voided. And the delegates, the representatives of each state, would be the governors of the states in question. And so that particular approach is envisioned as a way to contain a proposed convention and to prevent the existence of a runaway convention. I would suggest to you, however, that compacts can be entered into, they can be entered out of, if that makes sense. In other words, you can back out of them just as easily as you can get into them. And indeed, you know, if there is an agenda on the part of people at the convention, at the proposed convention, that would go outside the parameters of this one amendment, then the issue would be, there would be a serious question as to whether in fact you could contain such a convention. So I think you know, this is the mere fact that these particular rules have been drafted suggests a recognition that there is indeed the danger of what we've called and what George Will referred to as a runaway convention. I'd like to share with you, if I can, an example of just that. Going through my papers here, if you'll just hold on for one moment. I've been looking at the internet, and I've been looking specifically at reactions. First of all, looking for reactions, as well as looking at the reactions to this idea of the second convention. And I've gotten a lot of indications that there is quite a bit of thinking out there that once the convention convenes, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for people who have their own particular agenda. This, they believe, would obviously be the only chance that they would ever have to enact whatever the particulars of the agenda that they had in mind were about. So when we use the term runaway convention, the implication of runaway convention is nobody can control it. What I'm suggesting is that there is serious and substantial evidence that there are interests behind the scenes who are very interested in controlling this convention and taking it beyond the limitations that we just talked about as being proposed by the Goldwater Institute. And the mere fact that that sentiment is there, that the opportunity presents itself, I would suggest to you, was reason enough for the founders to do whatever they felt that they needed to do in order to avoid a second convention. I think the message from the founders is clear. We've talked about this before, but I want to emphasize it again. James Madison himself was opposed to a Bill of Rights. All through the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention, Madison resisted calls for a Bill of Rights. He had a number of reasons why we didn't need it. He genuinely believed, I believe it was genuine, I've seen it in numerous letters that he's written, Madison believed that a Bill of Rights was not necessary. At some point, in some places, he pointed out that a specific Bill of Rights would be potentially dangerous to rights in that the mere mention of specific rights would tend to exclude rights that fell through the cracks, that weren't mentioned. In other words, when you start mentioning specifics, you always run into the danger of forgetting one or more. And since they aren't mentioned when so many other specifics are mentioned, then the interpretation later on almost has to be that these omissions were intentional, when in fact, as Madison points out, they might not be intentional at all. It's kind of like when people get up to speak, get behind the microphone, so to speak, before a group. And they'll open up by saying, first of all, I want to thank all the people that were responsible for this event, whatever it is. And then they start listing the people. And there's always a danger that they're going to forget somebody. And so those who really are on top of situations like that will oftentimes avoid the naming of specific people and will sometimes say, I don't want to take the risk of offending or omitting anybody, so therefore I'm not going to go through the list of all the people, but I just want all of the people who are involved, and you know who you were, to know that you have our thanks or my thanks or whatever the case may be. In other words, and that was the message that Madison was making over and over again about a Bill of Rights. The other thing he mentioned was that people's concern about the need for a Bill of Rights focused on things like religious freedom and freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And Madison's point over and over again was that there's nothing in the business we're about here at the Philadelphia Convention that in any way suggests or even hints that anybody wants to do anything about people's right to speak freely or to have access to a free press or religious freedom or all the rest of it. In fact, Madison was one of the architects of the Virginia Bill for Religious Freedom in 1786 in Virginia, along with Jefferson. So Madison's point is we really don't need a Bill of Rights because the things that people worry about, there's no intent anyway. What Madison's point was, and we've been over this, over the last months here at the Virtual Center, the key issue at the Constitutional Convention was power, was federal power versus state power, and trying to reach the kind of balance between both that would render the nation and the government functional, but at the same time be functional in a way which did not benefit one particular interest group at the expense of others. In other words, that power wasn't so focused at the national level that state power was effectively destroyed, or on the other hand, that state power was so strong that government's ability to govern was effectively diminished, if not rendered impossible. So Madison's, point throughout was that the issue was power. It really didn't get into the idea of people's individual rights at all. So consequently, Madison resisted the need for a Bill of Rights. The point is that when ratification was going on, when states were being asked to ratify the new Constitution, it was becoming very clear that the lack of a Bill of Rights in the federal Constitution was becoming a problem, a political problem for Federalists, for supporters of this new government. Because opponents of it were pointing out, we hear you saying that individual rights are not an issue, but what they're saying is, if it's so meaningless, if there's no intent to interfere with rights, then what's the harm of protecting them? What's the harm of adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution and inserting in the Constitution specific protections for specific rights? So in other words, opponents of the Constitution were arguing that the lack of a Bill of Rights and the unwillingness of the Constitution's most avid supporters to include a Bill of Rights was raising serious questions in their mind. It raised doubts as to whether, in fact, the supporters of the Constitution were being upright and honest in what they were saying about the Constitution. Because it's one thing to say you don't need protection for your rights. But the fact of the matter is, even though it's not necessary, humor us. And so it was becoming very clear as ratification was moving from state to state in late 1787 and in the spring of 1787 and the spring of 1788. It was becoming very clear that the absence of a Bill of Rights might in fact sink ratification of the Constitution. And when the election was held for the Virginia Ratifying Convention, which convened in June of 1788, Madison spoke to the assembled convention in Richmond and shifted to support for a Bill of Rights and promised that the Bill of Rights would be the first order of business for the new Congress once the Constitution was ratified and once the new federal government went into operation. And Madison pointed out in many of his letters to colleagues and friends that the addition of a Bill of Rights would disarm the Constitution's major opponents. And what that suggests is that Madison recognized that as long as the Bill of Rights wasn't there, the opponents of the Constitution had something to hang their political hats on. And the way you eliminate that threat to the Constitution is to add a Bill of Rights, provided you determine what the Bill of Rights will say. Madison ends up chairing the committee that receives all the recommended amendments from all the states. And he sifts through these and comes up with those amendments that become our Bill of Rights once they are ratified. In effect, then, and Madison makes this point in his private letters as well, that there were really two kinds of amendments being proposed to the Constitution. There were the individual rights amendments, like the right to free speech and freedom of the press and jury trial and these other things. But then there were the more substantive amendments which would materially weaken the power of the central government under the Constitution. In other words, some of the amendments being proposed would alter the power relationship between states and federal government. Those amendments Madison was very, very careful and suspicious of. Those are the ones he wanted out of there. So what we are left to conclude, and I think this is very significant, what we must conclude then is that the rights that end up in our Bill of Rights are considered by the man who drafted the Constitution to be safe. I'm not going to say that they're rather meaningless, but in terms of Madison's sincere belief that this issue wasn't about individual human civil rights anyway, the fact of the matter is they really weren't necessary. The Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution principally in order to get the Constitution ratified. Its purposes were political. And the substance of those amendments was for the most part considered to be relatively inconsequential to the major decisions that were involved. Decisions related to the allocation and distribution of power. The point I think we need to make, and keep in mind then, is that Madison's willingness to switch from opposition to a Bill of Rights to support for a Bill of Rights was based principally on his fear that opponents of the Constitution were using the absence of a Bill of Rights as justification for the calling of a second convention. And Madison made very clear that if we ever get the Constitution back on the table again, then everything that we've accomplished will be lost. To Madison, the worst thing that could possibly happen in this country was another constitutional convention. And here we are on the cusp of Congress calling such a convention. One publication, which I'll address in a moment in more detail, one publication made mention of the fact that Michigan's call for the convention as the 34th state was, quote, the most important political development in 200 years in this country. And there's another comment that I read in looking through this stuff, which suggested that the decision to call a constitutional convention might be the most important political decision in the world in the last couple of hundred years. If you look on the internet, you will note that there's an awful lot of traffic and an awful lot of discussion about the potential as well as the dangers of a second convention. And what I would like to suggest and what I would like to focus our program on is taking a serious look at who's really pushing this and what they're after. What I'd like to begin to do, at least in our second hour today, and probably continue into tomorrow, is take another look at Mark Levin's Liberty Amendments in his book entitled The Liberty Amendments: Restoring the American Republic. That book and the amendments proposed in it are getting an awful lot of attention. And there is a very, very clearly defined political perspective that is surfacing on what this convention is about. I would suggest to you that those who have read and written raving reviews of Mark Levin's book, which only came out this past fall, I think it came out in August of 2013. So it's only been out about 7 months. But what it suggests is an agenda that would require the second convention. And Levin's book, while the bulk of it focuses on each of the amendments proposed, the first chapter of his book specifically addresses the opportunities that Article 5 of the Constitution presents to those who would amend the Constitution around these particular recommended amendments. In other words, Levin saw the political leverage and the political advantages to be gained by moving away from the traditional, always used version of amending the Constitution to the convention strategy, which had never been used. And this is the point where I think it's necessary to make a couple of general concluding statements which are really significant in this. Because I think that these particular points related specifically to the founders, to me suggest that there is an agenda here to call the convention and not confine it to one issue, whether it be balanced budget amendment or anything else. There's so much evidence that there are so many people who would want to use a second convention to pursue an agenda that goes way beyond one particular amendment. It suggests to me that there's more threat in the convening of a second convention than there is opportunity. A second convention becomes, for all practical purposes, a vehicle for people who are committed to destroying this political system as we know it. I don't know how else to say that. Once you get this convention called, once these people are sitting around the table, it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for political ideologues. There's no way that political ideologues who have committed their lives to a particular definition of change are going to consider letting the opportunity of a second convention pass without giving their agenda a chance. There's no way that these people are going to accept a compact reached among the states prior to the convening of the convention to limit discussions and limit debates to one issue. This is too important, and too many people have worked too hard and too long to perpetrate a revolution here. And the second convention is the opportunity for it. And let me say, those of us who haven't really thought about this had better start thinking seriously about it now. We cannot afford to ignore this situation any longer. I looked at a number of websites. This particular one is one that I want to call your attention to because of its title. It's called Godlike Productions. I think that tells us a lot, doesn't it? Here are just a couple of letters, comments, printed on that website about what Michigan has done and about the opportunity that it presents. I would suggest to you, just listen. Michigan has just become the 34th state to request an all-call for the Convention of States for a change to the Constitution. By constitutional law, 2/3 of the states must request a convention, and Michigan has brought this number to the needed 34. Perhaps we could move back to a confederacy form of government, like we had between the Civil War and the ratification of the current Constitution. Let me read that sentence again. Perhaps we could move back to a confederacy form of government, like we had between the Civil War and the ratification of the current Constitution. It's pretty obvious that there was a period between the American Revolution and the current Constitution, but there was no period between the Civil War and ratification of our Constitution, since the Civil War happened since the Civil War happened 90 years after ratification. Ratification was in 1787. The Civil War was in the 1860s. So we're talking 80 years later here, not the period before. So, is this a typographical error? Or are we dealing with a mentality here which suggests what's liable to happen at a convention? It seems to me we're dealing with bananas here. I'm going to continue. There was a time in America when we operated very well without a national government. We were but a collection of states that agreed to be good neighbors, good business partners, and to defend each other in case of war. The state was supreme. No need for the oppressive legislation from a federalized system. We could bring back our federal legislators from the black hole known as D.C., have them tried in state courts as conspirators and subversives against our American way of life, have them labeled for treason, tear down the non-federal reserve system, aka international monetary rapists, and live our lives without being marginalized by our own government. Yes, we can do this. Tell me that there is not sentiment out there to take the existence of a prospective of a likely constitutional convention and turn it into something like this. Here's a second letter. We could no longer cater to NATO, fund the World Bank, or be called to be global muscle for all other nations. All treaties previously made by the U.S. federal government would cease to exist. There can be no national armed military, but would be replaced by a voluntary state militia. This actually worked extremely well before we were fighting to protect other countries' lands instead of our own. No more federal unions to shove down our throats. No more Department of Education to ensure our children's place last in the world in math and science. Maybe other countries will stop laughing at the rich, stupid kids from the federalized education system of the United States. Individual states can decide if oil, gas, and coal production is in their best interest. States will have to stand on their own 2 feet, as they will not be bailed out by their surrounding neighbor states. Each state will have to learn to be a viable entity to themselves, and will have the freedom to develop their own natural resources in ways that prosper themselves. No Department of Energy, land management, homeland security. There will be no need for federalized income tax. No more federalized handouts. Yes, people are going to have to work to feed themselves, starting with the leechers in Washington. I would suggest to you that that kind of mentality suggests to me that we better take the threat of a constitutional convention pretty seriously. Here's another. This is pretty much quoted from an organization called TRN News. TRN News, translated, is talk radio news. And it again speaks to Michigan as being the 34th state. And this from TRN News. The most important political development in 200 years was triggered last week when the state legislature of Michigan became the 34th state to demand a constitutional convention in the United States. Under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, if 2/3 of the states call for such a convention, meaning 34 states, it must take place. Must is capitalized. During such a convention, the entire Constitution can be changed. Nothing is off limits. This would even allow the states to dismantle the federal government without its consent and repudiate the debt which that government has incurred. When it voted for the convention last week, Michigan became the 34th state, thus meeting the requirement. During such a convention, the entire Constitution can be changed. Nothing is off limits. This would even allow the states to dismantle the federal government without its consent and repudiate the debt which that government has incurred. It goes on. A goal has been reached behind what would be an unprecedented effort to amend the U.S. Constitution through a little-known provision that gives states rather than Congress the power to initiate changes. This is the most significant political development in the entire world in the last 200 years. At issue is what's known as a constitutional convention, a scenario tucked into Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. I would suggest to you, if it's a little-known provision, it's little known for a reason. And then this piece goes into the fact that Article 5 provides 2 ways for amendments to be proposed. The first, which has been used for all 27 amendments to date, requires 2/3 of both houses, of both the House and the Senate, to approve a resolution before sending it to the states for ratification. The Founding Fathers, though, devised an alternative way which says if 2/3 of state legislatures demand a meeting, Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments. The implication here is that the Founding Fathers wanted this option for the states. I would suggest to you that that is not true. But it is a major part of this whole effort, which is to appropriate the founders and enlist them as supporters for this call for a constitutional convention. More than anything else, this is what convinces me that we must seek a solution to this call for a convention should it happen. Let me go on with TRN News. In the wake of the vote, California Republican Representative Duncan Hunter pressed House Speaker John Boehner on today to determine whether the states just crossed the threshold for this kind of convention. Like Michigan lawmakers, Hunter's interest in the matter stems from a desire to push a balanced budget amendment, something that could be done at a constitutional convention. Quote, based on several reports and opinions, Michigan is the 34th state to issue such a call and therefore presents the constitutionally required number of states to begin the process of achieving a balanced budget amendment, Hunter wrote. Then the article goes on and says, but Article 5 is rather vague, and it's ultimately unclear whether 34 states have technically applied. In the past, states like Oregon, Utah, and Arizona have quietly voted to approve the provision in their legislatures, but some of the 34 or so have rescinded their requests. Others have rescinded and then reapplied. Alabama rescinded its request in 1988, but in 2011 lawmakers again applied for a convention related to an amendment requiring that the federal budget be balanced. It was a similar story in Florida in 2010. Louisiana rescinded in 1990, but lawmakers have tried several times unsuccessfully to reinstate the application since then. So consequently, the question is, can a state rescind its initial call for a convention? Since this strategy, this approach to amending the Constitution has never been used before, these questions are all up in the air. They are right now with Speaker John Boehner. And then TRN News addresses a section entitled Changes That Can Be Made. And I will tell you that this particular section is what caused today's program to appear to me to be a very, very important one. Change from a federal form of national government back to a confederacy, which was what existed prior to adoption of the Constitution in 1789. No, not the one that existed during the Civil War. The one that existed between the time we won the Revolutionary War and the time we adopted the U.S. Constitution. What's that you say? You never knew that the United States was a confederacy before the Constitution? So much for public school education. In fact, the U.S. was a confederacy, and under that form of government, there is no national government. Just states that agree to do business with each other and to defend each other if attacked. How's that for simple? If we make the mistake of keeping a federal government, we could dramatically curtail its powers. All elected officials could be term limited. Judges could be term limited. The jurisdiction of the federal government could be for commerce only, no longer allowing it criminal prosecution powers, leaving that to the states alone. All treaties currently in force could be scrapped. We could cancel our participation in NATO, no longer having to ensure the safety of Europe by shedding American blood to settle their squabbles. Parentheses, World War I, World War II, Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, etc. Make Europe defend itself. We could scrap the treaties with South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, making them defend themselves rather than pledging American blood to keep them safe. After all, for the 50 years or more that we have guaranteed the security of these countries, what have they done for us? Hint, nothing. We could scrap the treaties with Russia concerning our nuclear arsenal, allowing us to rearm to face the new challenges posed by China becoming a superpower, India, Pakistan, and Israel becoming nuclear powers. We could do away with the federal power to make war, delegating that power to a simple majority of the 50 state legislatures voting in concert. We could do away with the Federal Reserve, which creates money out of thin air, causing inflation to erode our savings and earnings, and start printing our own real money, backed by gold, silver, platinum, etc. No more central bankers to parasite off our hard work the way they do now. We could do away with the Code of Federal Regulations and the Federal Register, both of which stifle American ingenuity through reams of governmental regulation. We could put people ahead of animals and do away with rules that forbid development of land because some little creature lives on it. We could do away with the Department of Education, which during its existence has seen the education level of American children drop from #1 in the world to somewhere toward the bottom. This department is a complete and total failure, and it should be wiped out of existence. We could do away with the Department of Energy, which was created during the Carter administration for the purpose of weaning the United States off imported oil. Ask yourself this simple question. In the 40 years it's been in existence, has the Department of Energy even come close to achieving what it was created to do? No. It is another total failure, and it should be wiped out of existence. We could become energy self-sufficient within a year by allowing our own natural resources to be developed. Then tell the Arabs to take their oil and shove it. We could stop the handouts to the permanent welfare class, forcing them to get off their good-for-nothing lazy butts and get a job. We could do away with the income tax. We could restore the free market in every industry, getting government out of the way, so that entrepreneurs could create new and better products and services to improve all our lives. This would be a new beginning for America, a new chance at vast prosperity, personal liberty, and personal responsibility. The last time there was a successful amendment was more than 4 decades ago, the 26th Amendment, which changed the voting age to 18. States ratified the 27th Amendment on congressional pay increases, but it took more than 200 years to do it. With the Michigan vote this time, we can right so many wrongs and finally get the government out of our lives. When I read that, I really thought that we better come back to this issue and pursue it again. When George Will talked about those who were concerned about a runaway convention, these people have literally come out from under rocks. I do believe that this is the greatest threat that this republic has faced since it was created 200 plus years ago. I think what makes it dangerous, as much as anything else, is so few people know about it. I mentioned at the beginning of this hour that I'm delivering a program tomorrow to our local Rotary Club, because most of those folks, prominent business people in this region, know very little, if anything at all, about Michigan's vote, about Article 5, about the founders, and especially about the agenda that these wingnuts have in mind once such a convention meets. I mentioned earlier in the program that there's evidence that progressives are beginning to look at the potential of a second convention as a way to get rid of Citizens United. I would suggest to you, you got a better chance of winning Powerball than seeing that happen in the face of this kind of organized opposition. We have reached the top of the hour. It's 5 p.m. in the East. Let's pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back and we'll continue with today's version of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to the second hour of today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. It is Monday, the 5th day of May, and it is a pleasure to be with you. If you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. If you've been with us through the first hour, then I thank you for staying with us. And if you have a reaction to that little ditty from TRN News, Talk Radio News, I would love to hear it. To me, it's one of the most frightening things that I've read in a long time. Because not only does it suggest a mentality, but it also suggests the constituency that is behind and supporting and is being fed by and manipulated by those who are much brighter and much more insightful and much more aware of the seriousness of what they're doing. I would suggest to you that I think it is very, very important that we take seriously Mark Levin's book on the so-called Liberty Amendments, and that we take very seriously the rather reputable support that those particular items in that particular book is receiving. It's very obvious that there's no way that the group who knows and understands what's going on could pull this off unless they are able to garner the support of the kinds of folks that authored those pieces that we just read toward the end of our last hour. I would suggest to you we are dealing with one of the most dangerous political situations of demagoguery that we've seen in this country for a long time. And this time, we're dealing with the jugular. This time, they are playing with the political structure of this republic itself. And I would suggest to you that thinking, reputable people, I don't care whether they call themselves moderates or conservatives or whatever they are, but they must find a way, they must be forced to confront the reality of what they are playing with here. I've mentioned this before, and I don't want to go off on a tangent. But communication theory oftentimes confounds people who don't realize what contemporary research and theory on communications alleges and suggests. Many people believe that communication is to be measured by what's intended by the speaker or the writer. In other words, at the source of the particular communication we're talking about. But the fact of the matter is, communication theorists make the point that communication is and must be defined not by what's sent, but by what's received. In other words, it's what people believe they're hearing and reading that defines the communication, not the intent behind it. For a long time, people have made the effort to sort of wash their hands, Pontius Pilate-like, of responsibility for what they say and what they write. How many times have we heard this about those who advocate the use of guns? And then you have something like the disaster in Connecticut at Newtown. And it's not my fault. It was some nut that went crazy with a gun. It's not my fault. I'm not responsible for it. I would suggest to you that communication theory suggests that there is a responsibility on the part of those who would communicate ideas and positions on the results that happen as a result of what you do. We all know that while our First Amendment talks about free speech, it does not absolve the speaker from liability. You can still be sued. The mere fact that there is a First Amendment doesn't give you the right to say what you want, when you want, where you want, to whom you want, whenever you want. You are liable. The rules of law mean that you can be held accountable for what you say and what you write. Yet we have these people, and I'm going right back, without mentioning, to talk radio news, but we have these people who can say some of the most horrendous, outrageous things and then try to claim total non-responsibility for what happens as a result of what they say and what they advocate. And there is responsibility. And for those people who would define themselves as serious, literate, committed people, conservative people, who see the need for change in our political system, it is absolutely vital that these folks be forced to look directly at what they have fired up. It's impossible to continue to advocate something like a second convention and at the same time assume that you can wash your hands of all responsibility for what might happen once it happens. There is responsibility. There is accountability. Recently had occasion in a class to read essays that students wrote on Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And in that letter, he's talking about civil disobedience. And he's talking about the accountability and responsibility aspect of this. If you break the law, you must expect to be arrested. You must expect to do jail time. And he is writing that letter from a jail cell. And what he's criticizing are those who feel that they can say whatever they want, and not be responsible for the results. I think one of the strategies we need to adopt as concerned citizens, as those people who are focusing on the civic responsibility portion of the virtual center, need to recognize there is responsibility that goes along with what we do and what we say and what we advocate. So I think it is very, very important that we know and we understand what we're doing. Let me, before we get too far into the second hour, let me once again give you our phone number as well as my email address, and encourage you to feel comfortable communicating with me, or more important, to get coming on the air and expressing your views and your ideas on some of these issues, because I think they warrant some conversation and some dialogue. The phone number here is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you'd like to communicate via email directly with me, then I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I want this hour to at least begin to get into a serious look at some of Mark Levin's recommendations for change, the so-called Liberty Amendments. Because I think the level of the level on which they are conceived is quite a bit different than the level we looked at in the piece previously. But I must insist that we recognize that the two are connected, and that we are responsible. We do reap what we sow. And I think there is a responsibility, and I think serious, concerned, progressive people need to force those people who would do damage to this republic to stand up and face accountability and responsibility for what they are doing, that they must be forced to understand. And that Pontius Pilate sounds good, but old Pontius Pilate doesn't quite work in this particular situation. There's one thing that I would point out, and this is me talking. I'm not reading any text here or anything else. But one of the things that bothers me about this whole issue is a level of dishonesty, of academic or intellectual dishonesty that's associated with a lot of this. I've mentioned this numerous times in numerous ways. And it seemed to me, as I was thinking about today's program, that before we get into the details of the Liberty Amendments, that one of the things we ought to do is take a look from a more global, more cosmopolitan perspective, from a distance, if you will, at the big picture. And one of the things that we see over and over again are serious efforts of bright, intelligent people to enlist America's founders in this particular political campaign that we're talking about here. Not only is a lot of it intellectually dishonest, but it's dangerous, because it doesn't suggest a serious effort to consider the evidence and consider the facts and make decisions accordingly. Rather, it suggests a determination, a commitment to a particular set of objectives that is so strong that one becomes willing to manipulate the evidence in order to justify the conclusions desired. When it comes to the founders, many of these folks are cherry-picking the evidence. They're taking statements that the founders made out of context and literally turning the authors of those statements on their heads, so to speak. And that they are asserting that the authors of these statements meant something totally different than they really did, than they really meant when they said or wrote the particular line or the particular paragraph in question. In the debates that we've been talking about, the Federalist Papers themselves are a clear example of this. The Federalist Papers were written by the founders, by Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, and addressed to the people of the state of New York in order to convince the citizens of New York that ratification of the Constitution was the right way to go. New York was one of those states which elected a lot of opponents to the Constitution to its ratifying convention. There was serious question as to whether ratification was even possible given the makeup of the New York Convention, ratifying convention. In fact, the first convention that New York called was overwhelmingly dominated by anti-federalists, by opponents of the Constitution. Consequently, the convention adjourned and the membership changed, so that when the convention reconvened, there was much more of a balance between Federalists and anti-Federalists in the makeup of the convention. But ratification was clearly in doubt, and John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, who were citizens, residents of New York, knew it. And they knew that ratification in New York was going to be tough. And so they took it upon themselves to begin to draft the series of essays which was designed principally to convince citizens who weren't sure that the Constitution was a good thing and would be a good thing and was a necessary thing. And in order to make the case, they had to reassure those in doubt that many of their fears were unfounded. Consequently, the authors of the Federalist Papers found themselves in positions where they were arguing things that they didn't necessarily believe were true. I'm not saying that they lied, But what I'm saying is they weren't telling the total truth, if that makes sense. Let's look, for example, at the issue on the table right now, which is amending the Constitution, Article 5. Article 5 says that there are two ways to amend the Constitution. The first way is when an amendment is passed, is approved by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate. When 2/3 of both houses approve an amendment, then that amendment is sent out to the states for ratification. And it must receive 3/4 of the states' approval in order to become part of the Constitution of the United States. There is a second method of amending the Constitution in Article 5. And the second method is focused on the origin of the amendments coming from the states rather than from the central government. In other words, instead of coming from the top down, the second strategy, the second method of amendment, proposes amendments that will go from the bottom to the top, from the states to Congress. Namely, it says, when 2/3 of the states, 2/3 of state legislatures, request an amendment, Congress shall call a convention for the purposes of addressing that request. And whatever business the convention does is then submitted to the states, and it becomes part of the Constitution when it receives 3/4 of the states' approval. We know, and many of the pieces that I've read today kind of reinforce this, all the amendments to the U.S. Constitution so far have operated according to the first method. 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate, have approved the amendment, and then the amendment has been sent out for ratification by 3/4 of the states. The convention strategy, the convention method, has never been used. That's the one that's on the table now. Now, back to the issue here, which is the whole issue of cherry-picking the evidence. Using the article that we looked at last week by George Will as the most recent example, George Will makes the case and cites Federalist 85, the last of the 85 Federalist Papers, for evidence. He suggests that the founders wanted to check a runaway federal government by making sure that the states still had the power to amend the Constitution. George Will is making the point that the founders were afraid of too much power in the central government, and that they were concerned about preserving some of the power that, the power that the states had. And so therefore, consequently, they put in this second method of amending the Constitution, but it's never been used. I would suggest to you that many of these people know better than that. George Will's one who should know better. The Constitution of the United States was written, was drafted, and ratified in order to take power away from the states. Madison's Vices of the American Political System lays out in spades the abuses to government that existed during the Confederation period as justification for the need for a constitution. Hamilton, on the floor of the United States, on the floor of the convention, made the point that he didn't believe that the Constitution, as written, created a government that was strong enough. But he was willing to admit that it's clear after 3 months of debate, it's the strongest we've got a chance of getting. It's the best we're going to get. But he was skeptical that it was enough. The founders were not worried about too much power in the hands of the federal government. They were worried about not enough. What am I saying here? Because I think that this is very, very significant. What I'm saying here, that the biggest challenge that those who would amend the Constitution and call this convention what they find themselves forced to do is turn the founders into their allies, when in fact the founders are their opponents. We've been focusing on Federalist 85. So let me go back to a couple of relevant sections from Federalist 85 from Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton says in Federalist 85, he has the following sentence: "For my own part, I acknowledge a thorough conviction that any amendments which may, upon mature consideration, be thought useful, will be applicable to the organization of the government, not to the mass of its powers." Hamilton believes that the only serious amendments proposed would be amendments related to the structure, to the organization of the government, not to the issue of power. Hamilton believed that. He said it's his own thorough conviction. The fact that he believed that meant that the only method of amendment that he could support was the top-down Congress to the states. He could not support amendments coming from the states because their amendments would be most likely to attempt to whittle away at the power of the federal government. He didn't want that. Mark Levin's Liberty Amendments all have one thing in common. They are designed to minimize the power of the federal government, and for the most part, to do that by enhancing state power. That means that every one of the amendments being proposed is an amendment that Hamilton would have opposed. So how do the George Wills and Sean Hannitys of the world get away with turning the founders into their supporters? The only way they can do it is manipulate the evidence. They are not interpreting history. They are manipulating it by using history and cherry-picking the evidence, taking it out of context in order to support the particular position that they are trying to advocate, when in fact the founders were arguing for a position totally contrary to what these advocates of a constitutional convention are supporting. Hamilton says later on in Federalist 85, but there is yet a further consideration which proves beyond the possibility of a doubt that the observation is futile. And the observation, if you'll recall, was a suggestion made that once federal office holders got into power, they would be reluctant to make any changes in the Constitution at all. Hamilton was arguing that many of those people that were looking at Article 5, the convention's strategy for amendments, were really concerned about the Constitution because their argument was, once we ratify and once these people take office, they will not be inclined to accept any amendments at all. And Hamilton is setting out to reassure people who believe this that they needn't worry. And so he says this further consideration proves that that observation is futile. He said, it is this, that the national rulers, whenever 9 states concur, will have no option upon the subject. By the 5th article of the plan, the Congress will be obliged, and then he quotes the entire section of the 5th article about the calling of a convention. Once you get 2/3 of the states, Congress shall call the convention. Then Hamilton says the words of this article are peremptory. The Congress shall call a convention, unquote. Nothing in this particular is left to the discretion of that body. And of consequence, all the declamation about the disinclination to a change vanishes in air. In other words, Hamilton is pointing to the second method of amending, which is the states calling a convention. And he's pointing to that in order to reassure doubtful citizens that it's there. And they needn't worry about the power of the federal government once it gets into office, because that particular strategy for amendment is there if needed. But obviously he doesn't want it. He just said earlier, that whatever changes would come would deal with the organization of the government, not to the mass of its powers. Well, obviously the proposed changes that would come from the states would be directly affecting the mass of its powers. So obviously Hamilton didn't want or didn't expect the convention method to ever be used. But the reason it was there is in order to satisfy doubtful citizens that they needn't worry about the power of the federal government. He's trying to assuage them. He's trying to pacify them. He's trying to settle them down. He's trying to reassure them. He's not advocating state power. He's not advocating amendments coming from the states through conventions. He's already said that he doesn't want that. So how does George Will go about or get about turning Hamilton into an advocate for states' rights? Hamilton closes that section, and this is the sentence that George Will quotes in his article. We may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority. So in that one sentence, if you take it out of context, we may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority. If you take that sentence out of context, Hamilton becomes an advocate for states erecting barriers against federal power, when in fact that is exactly what Hamilton is not in favor of. But the entire set of Federalist Papers, all 85 of them, are designed to persuade and convince and reassure the doubters that the new Constitution will work and be safe. And that's what we've got to realize. If these people who are pushing so hard for amendments for a second convention are willing to manipulate the founders and manipulate the past and cherry pick evidence and use the framers to support their own contemporary political agenda, then we must oppose them. We must expose them. We must expose the duplicity with which they are doing this. As uncomfortable as it might be, we must highlight and turn the light of day upon the ignorance that these people are catering to in order to get their way. This is the way that they have taken control of all of these states. The reason they're going through the state legislatures calling conventions is because they've been able to get control of state legislatures by not focusing so much on national elections, but looking at state houses and state legislatures and turning loose the immense amount of money that the Adelsons and the rest of them, and the Koch brothers and the rest of them are putting into the political process, that they are able to work from the bottom up to get their way because they're dealing with a citizenry that is pretty much ignorant of what the historical facts are. Consequently, they are falling for the cherry picking and the manipulation of evidence that these people are doing. It is dishonest, it is duplicitous, and we've got to expose it. And the reason we must, I can't, in good conscience, take seriously the effort to sit down and reason together about constructive changes in the Constitution of the United States when the people who are pushing for the convention to do that are willing to pull out all sorts of stops and engage in this kind of duplicity to get their way. The fact that they are willing to do anything, the fact that they have obviously believed that the ends justify the means, that alone causes me to stand back and say, no, we must fight you. We cannot reason with you. We cannot negotiate with you. Because if you are willing to go to these lengths to get this convention called, then your agenda must be one that is not positive. It must be. If you look at Hamilton's last paragraph of Federalist 85, and especially at the very last sentence in Federalist 85, which is effectively the very last sentence of all of the Federalist Papers, you would realize where Hamilton really stands. Hamilton closes Federalist 85 by saying the following: "A nation without a national government is, in my view, an awful spectacle. The establishment of a constitution in time of profound peace by the voluntary consent of the whole people is a prodigy, to the completion of which I look forward with trembling anxiety. I can reconcile it to no rules of prudence to let go the hold we now have in so arduous an enterprise upon 7 out of the 13 states, and after having passed over so considerable a part of the ground, to recommence the course." What Hamilton is saying is, there's nothing to be gained at this point in the ratification process. We've got 7 states in line. 7 states have ratified. 7 out of the 13. Why should we go back now and allow there to be another convention? We would lose everything that we've gained. And then Hamilton says in his very last sentence, "I dread the more the consequences of new attempts, because I know that powerful individuals in this and in other states are enemies to a general national government in every possible shape." What Hamilton is saying in the very last line of the very last of the Federalist Papers is that the last thing we want to do is give these powerful individuals who are the enemies of a general national government totally a forum. The last thing you want to do is make it possible for them to pull off what they want. Consequently, whatever you have to do to make sure that these people never get the floor in another constitutional convention is to make sure that a constitutional convention is never called. If there are specific things about the Constitution of the United States that are not working, then let's target them and identify them and debate them and negotiate and put them out for a vote and amend the Constitution if that's what's called for. But I would suggest to you that the calling of a convention suggests that there's not something wrong with the way the government is operating. There's everything wrong with the way the Constitution is operating. Therefore, everything must be changed. That's what the purpose of the convention would be about. That's the operating strategy of those who would call it. And that suggests the agenda of those people who are trying to pull this off. Mark Levin, in his book on the Liberty Amendments, opens the book with a very strong, passionate argument in favor of going to Article 5, specifically to the convention strategy. In other words, this idea of calling for a constitutional convention, to Mark Levin, is not just the way to get a balanced budget amendment debated and added to the Constitution. To him, a convention is a way to pull off a whole series of changes in the Constitution of the United States. To quote Hamilton in Federalist 85, Mark Levin's strategy is based on a desire to make changes in the mass of government powers, not only or merely in its organization. Exactly what Hamilton said amendments must be, Mark Levin is saying, not the amendments we want. The amendments we want are just the opposite. We want amendments that will alter the power of the government. I would suggest to you that is revolution. That is the equivalent of the initial first Constitutional Convention's decision to scrap the Articles of Confederation. What Mark Levin's amendments would do is effectively scrap the Constitution of the United States as it currently exists. And restore something resembling the Articles of Confederation. The idea of a confederacy with the most significant power focused principally on the state level. I would suggest to you that it's very important to look at each of Levin's amendments to understand what they are and what their implications are, and more importantly, what they would accomplish in terms of changing the present structure and mode of operation of our political system, of our republic. And it's very obvious from the writing that appeared in internet sites like TRN News, Talk Radio News, and I'm thumbing back for the other, godlike productions, that we are dealing with a mentality that is significantly different than Mark Levin's. But I would suggest to you that it is a mentality that would support Mark Levin. What we're dealing with here is, it's really interesting. I'm thinking back to Sam Adams prior to the Declaration of Independence during the movement in Boston in the 1770s, especially 1775, 1773, the Boston Tea Party, all the way up to 1775. And I'm specifically thinking about the writings of Governor Hutchinson, who's pointing out that these people who are instilling this hostility against the mother country are loosing a force that they will be hard put to control. I would suggest to you that Mark Levin and George Will and Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and all the rest of them are doing the same thing. They are running the risk of unleashing a force that they will have difficulty controlling. It is a mentality that would say all previous treaties made by the United States federal government would cease to exist. No more federal unions to shove down our throat. No more departments of education to ensure our children's last place in the world in math and science. It'll be up to individual states to decide if oil, gas, and coal production is in their best interests. States will have to stand on their own 2 feet. Didn't the same piece say earlier that in the golden times when the states were in confederacy and they worked together by compact, now they're going to be required to stand on their own 2 feet rather than being bailed out by their surrounding states. There'll be no more federal income tax. There'll be no more government. What that means is those that currently control the states that are calling for this convention will be in power once the federal government's power over the states is rendered impotent. Once the convention is called and their agenda is on the table, the power of the federal government to contain it ceases to exist. And if they can get control of the convention, they effectively have control over the nation. And then the question is, what is to limit the level of change? How do we limit the level of the degree of change? So I would suggest that this is very, very serious business we're in here. And I think we need to be very, very knowledgeable and very, very careful. I think we need to understand Levin's amendments. We need to understand what they propose and why they propose it. We need to understand what they would do if implemented. And we need to recognize that the only way that these things could even get on the table is if they came up through states that were under the control of those who are pushing for this convention. Let me say that again, because I think this is a good way to bring our program today to a conclusion. There's no way on their own that these amendments could withstand the rigorous debate at the national level with a national viewing audience and achieve the 2/3 vote that they would need to go out to the states for approval. They wouldn't have a chance. The only way that they have a chance is to come up through states, the legislatures of which are controlled by the inordinate ounce of campaign money pouring into these local and state elections, and gerrymandering districts within legislatures in such a way that once these people are elected to office, they can't be thrown out. They can't be voted out. What you have guaranteed, what you have done is build in at the state level, at the foundational level, a structure of support which gives you virtually unlimited power to not be challenged once you gain a forum to enact your strategy or your agenda. The convention that is being called is that forum. We cannot allow it to happen. We must stop it. Tomorrow we'll take a look at Levin's amendments in some detail. I invite you to be with us. I ask you to be safe, and I thank you for being with us today. Bob Kincaid will be with you in less than a minute with his program. Stay tuned, and thank you.